Hey there. Welcome to First Look. Thanks for being here with me as I took this on the road today. I'm having one of those weird days where I'm doing this from Panera. So, so anyway, thanks for joining me. I still have coffee. We're still good to go. So I'm just we're rolling with the punches today. So thanks for coming along with me. Um, it's in a different location, but it's still weird art hanging behind me. I don't even know what it is. It's like a person making bread. Anyway, uh, so this week we now go back to what we were doing before. We had a week off there where we were talking about Isaiah and we were talking about that preface to the story. But this goes back right into where we were in the book of Luke, and this is one of those passages that I know you know, but it's not always easy to know what to do with. And I just looked up to see what the passage was. So you're getting a pretty literal first look. So we're gonna look at it together. It's right at the end of chapter 12, and I thought that while we start, I would just remind you where we were previously in chapter 12. So let me get there. So what we've been doing in Luke is kind of looking at um, these pretty important texts from right in the middle of kind of this teaching arc of Jesus. And so if you look at the things that we were doing just a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the Lord's Prayer and the kind of formative and radical thoughts that are in the Lord's Prayer. And as much as we kind of, I think, look past it too often, it's there where so much that really changes the way we see the world and the way that the people would have seen the world. And then we moved on, and we were talking about this longer conversation that Jesus was having, that began with him having dinner with some Pharisees and lawyers, and that didn't go well, and it kind of led to a big screaming match. And eventually, we have Jesus talking to them and to the disciples as we move into chapter 12, about this parable of the rich fool. He has this conversation with the person who asked him the question about the inheritance that he's receiving, and Jesus tells them this parable of the rich fool who stored up treasures on earth instead of on in heaven. And I think if you go back to that sermon, what you'll see is I made a pretty clear reference to the passage that we're about to do here this week, because we were talking about this warning against the division that Jesus' words can bring. And if you're thinking about the way that sermon worked out, we were talking about this division between this brother and um, the man and his brother. And what we were saying is that the um, these two really, their problems are not going to be solved by whatever they do with the money. The real issue that I was seeing, the angle that I was taking, was that um, this is a relationship that's broken, and what do we do about that? And it's how it's manifesting itself in this problem with the inheritance, and what will happen once that problem is fixed. Like, those are all questions that we have. So this story, I won't be able to help but reference that sermon because I made the connection to this story, and so why wouldn't I continue to make those connections into the next sermon? So this one is about um, what Jesus' words will do within family systems, and really, if you're thinking about not just the literal family, but all the ways that we call each other family. So this is let's see, this is Luke starting in verse 49, Luke 12, verse 49. And it starts like this. I came to bring fire to the earth, and how I wish it were already kindled, meaning, why did I have to be the one to kindle it? I think that's an interesting way of starting. I have a baptism with which to be baptized, and what stress I am under until it is completed. Do you think that I have come to bring peace to the earth? No, I tell you, but rather division. From now on, 5 in a household will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3, and they will be divided. Father against son, son against father, mother against daughter, and daughter against mother, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. He also said to the crowds, when you see a cloud rising in the west, you immediately say it is going to rain, and so it happens. And when you see the south wind blowing, you say there will be scorching heat, and it happens. You hypocrites, you know how to interpret the appearance of earth and sky, but why do you not know how to interpret the present time? I like that passage for lots of different reasons. And I think it's fascinating because it gets at so many different types of elements of culture and life at once. First, we could spend a whole lot of time talking about the weather if we wanted to. Talking about how, like, the people at the time, since they didn't have the weather channel, had to really pay attention to, um, the little signs that got them into, or that gave them an idea of what was going to happen, right? Because, you don't want to get caught, you know, in a flood. You don't want to get caught, in a dust storm. You don't want to get caught, you know, planting crops and something happens that you didn't expect. Like, you know, it was very important to really pay attention to what was happening around you. And there are lots of modern examples of that, obviously. Um, the way that we kind of look around at the world and pay attention to what's happening in media or what's happening in sports or what's happening in our neighborhoods or in our kids' school or whatever it happens to be. You and I are people who pay attention to a lot of details about how to just make life work, right? We know how to work within the system that we have, and that's one of the operative things here, is that um, the people knew how to work within the system that they knew, right? With the rules the way they were set up, the laws the way they were set up, they understood how all that worked. And remember, the end of chapter 11 and the beginning of chapter 12, chapter 12 is where we're at now. We're at the end of 12. We talk about the Lord's Prayer and debts and debtors and trespasses and all of that. And we talk about how there's a critique of the system that they're in there, right? We talked about Jubilee, we talked about all of that. And then we had this conversation with Pharisees and lawyers, right? And those are the respected people in the society. And Jesus spends a lot of time critiquing the ways that they exist within that society. Those groups of people that I just mentioned knew how to work the system without really affecting any change whatsoever. They knew how to make it look like they were righteous without actually being righteous. And so there's a critique of that element of the system. And then there's this critique of the man who's complaining about his brother and the inheritance and what he's getting. And then he talks about the rich fool and, storing up all those things in barns and all of that. And none of those things were illegal, at least that we know of. We don't think that the brother was doing anything illegal. Just maybe not what the brother wanted or what was morally fair. But there was a critique again of systems and money and finances and wealth and all of that. And so as we move then into this passage, we continue to look at the places where people are used to working the system. They know the weather. They know how to, you know, make the day-to-day stuff work, but they don't know how to interpret the times. And so Jesus is literally asking them to step back and to look at the bigger picture, because something is about to happen that Jesus is ushering in that the people aren't really paying attention to. He's saying, you're not paying attention to what I'm trying to say is going to happen and needs to happen. Jesus is proclaiming something that people are not going to be ready for. And even though it sounds like a good thing, Jesus knows it's going to bring division. It's going to break things down. And we don't have to go any farther, really, than thinking about the church itself. Because if you asked, or if I asked, what is the church? What is our mission statement? What are we supposed to do? All of us, I think almost universally, would say it's a place where we love people. It's a place where we show grace to people. It's a place where we are invitational. It's a place where we pray for each other, where we, where we help those who are in need, where we reach out to the world in the name of the gospel. That's what we do, right? And yet, you have churches that go about that from very, very different perspectives, and we have individuals within those churches that go about that from very, very different perspectives. Because within our churches, we have very different ways of understanding the church's relationship with the individual, with the community, with politics, with government in general, our influence on culture or culture's influence on us, our opinions on social issues. All of those things there's always a division around. And I think Jesus recognizes that what he's saying maybe shouldn't be that, but knows that it is, and knows that it's necessary. I think that's the part of it that you see in the early part of this verse, is that Jesus says something about bringing fire, and boy, I wish this was already ignited. Meaning, I'm going to bring something that is going to turn the world on its head, and I wish that I didn't have to. Because all of you have had the prophets, all of you have had Moses, all of you have had the Torah, all of you have had God in your midst here in the promised land, and yet I am still here teaching you about how to love radically. And that's the part that he knows is the division part. Because, this is the obvious part, but if you understand who Jesus is in the community, there are obviously going to be people who decide to follow Jesus and people who decide not to. So if you think about the people who are gathered there to hear Jesus speak, if you think about the people who are there, the feeding of the 5,000, let's just take that for an example. There are probably people there sitting there with their families or with their child or something, and someone in their household or someone in their family doesn't agree with them being there. Them being out there was something that their family shunned, right? And we know that is true. Of course it would have been true that many people would have sided with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees were the known entities of religious authority. And, think about that for a minute. Think about who the Pharisees are today. They're people who look like me and have the same letters behind their name and are in, places of authority, and they're the establishment. The Pharisees were as much the establishment as, they were the old time religion, so to speak. And Jesus and his followers, and he didn't come with the right credentials. He didn't come with the kind of messianic pedigree. And yet all of these people were following him. Of course, that would have brought division. And of course, you and I, if we're going to think about that, have to think about it like, which side would we actually have been on? Would you have been that radical person siding with Jesus because it would have been obvious to you that you should be? Or would you have taken a more safe, established route and stayed where you were, stayed in your own lane, kept on worshiping? We talk about that a lot when it comes to at Easter time, I think. When we get to Easter and we get to Lent, we talk a lot about, um, where would you have been on Palm Sunday, but then where would you have been on Good Friday? We talk about that, like, at what point do we start to say, crucify him, right? Well, that division is very real, and that's what Jesus knows is happening and will happen, and that's what he knows that his message brings, even though it's a message of peace and unity and all those things. And humanity has had a history of not treating people who advocate for that very well. We, not to compare them in any way, shape, or form, but Martin Luther King didn't have an easy road, and Gandhi didn't have an easy road, and people who advocate for peace and unity and equality and justice usually don't have a very easy time of it. There's struggle, and it's uphill, and they're on the outside a lot, and there's violence, and all the things that there are, because things that disrupt the apple cart, the system as it is, right, is scary. And that's a lot of what you see in this passage. You see Jesus talking about it like that. Now, I think the other element to this, when we think about it from either a societal standpoint or even just a one-on-one, the kind of division that it can bring in families, or faith can bring in families, is, again, circling back to that earlier part that I was mentioning about the sermon I did a couple weeks ago. We have Jesus' message allowing us to look very clearly at the divisions that are already there, right? People get divided by things like this because there were cracks in their relationship that already existed, or the relationship was really just based on everyone following the rules as they were supposed to follow the rules. You know, Relationships can get broken by politics and by religion, often, but even outside of that, our relationships can be broken when the other person doesn't end up being who we thought either they were going to be or should have been. Relationships get broken when someone decides not to continue the family business. Relationships gets broken when someone decides to marry outside of their ethnic group or outside of their religious base. Or someone decides to, go into one field instead of being a doctor or a lawyer or whatever you thought they should be. Relationships get broken because people end up marrying someone that you didn't expect them to marry for whatever reason. When your identity is different than what people assumed your identity was, all of those things break up relationships. And I think that's the other element to this passage that I find intriguing is it's not just that, following Jesus could lead you to having to walk away from, a family that ends up being toxic or something, but that it exposes the idea that families are also not always built on unconditional love, grace, and compassion. That there's a breaking point. That's not true for every family, obviously, but I think that's the other. This is my first look, right? So that's the other element that I think is a part of this passage um, that I find interesting. And so I think um, what's fascinating about this particular text when it comes to the division that we see in it is not only what it means for us and what it means for the ways that we see um, the choices that we make and the ways we identify ourselves and that kind of thing. But, you know, it also says something about um, the world that the disciples were going to inherit, or the ministry that they were going to inherit after Jesus was gone. Because it may have been that people thought that you're the Messiah, you're going to make everything right, you're going to create a world where um, where things are finally the way that they're supposed to be, right? Rome will be gone, we will be in control. Um, we'll have the cushy seat um, where we should have always been. Um, that's the way the world will look whenever you finally reign. But there's a real warning, I think, to the disciples about what ministry will look like as they move forward. And I don't know if it's because there's this anticipation that, of course, they won't be considered within the Jewish faith forever, right? Even if that wasn't the intent. At some point, of course, they wouldn't just be some sect or part of Judaism. Judaism wouldn't all go with them. Not everyone was going to go in that direction. At some point, I'm sure Jesus understood or anticipated that they would be considered someone else, right? They would be the people of the way, they would be Christians, they would have to go another path. And that would divide people. Um, and that they wouldn't be able to go back. And you see that very clearly, that message of the division that the people have to undertake and absorb and learn how to live with in books like Hebrews. Look at the book of Hebrews. I know it's my favorite book, and I can talk about that all day. But that book speaks a lot to that division, and that was the world that the disciples had to maneuver in and find ways of finding unity in. And it was the world that Paul inherited, right? How do I bring this group and that group together? Um, People who are Gentiles, people who are not. How do I bring them together? How do I do that? You know, that kind of division, and then the struggle for unity within it would have, that was Jesus getting them ready for that struggle too. So I think it's a really interesting passage because of how I think relatable it is, even though the examples in it um, maybe aren't as modern, you know, paying attention to the weather and that kind of thing. But, it's, I think it's a really, um, it's the kind of passage that kind of puts you on notice. And I think that, one of the things that I really try to pay attention to is how we are consistently asked to not be comfortable. When it comes to Him, we're not supposed to be comfortable, I don't think. Um, and so this is one of those passages that does that. So that's my first take on it. That's what I'm hoping kind of gives you some food for thought as we move forward. Um, I think it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out. So thanks for joining me here. Thanks for thinking about that with me. Thanks for kind of contemplating all of that. So for now, just I appreciate you doing this with me, and I will certainly see you next time for another first look. So take care. Have a good week.